Okay, welcome everyone to our entrepreneur chat and question and answer today. I hope that you have all brought your questions for our guest, Kimberley Abbott. I'm Kristen Weatherby and I run Breakthrough Labs, which is an accelerator and community for female-founded tech startups. Our website's here on the screen and we are opening applications for our next cohort. So I would encourage you to go onto our website and register for the latest news if you haven't already. I'd like to introduce Kimberley Abbott to you today, and she is the founder and CEO of VestedImpact, which is a fintech startup that has won awards. And she has a really interesting background and story to tell. But I would just say about VestedImpact that its mission is to redefine millionaire as someone who makes an impact in millions of lives, which I think is just a lovely, lovely sentiment. So I am going to, without further ado, just get into Kim's story. So Kim, tell us a little bit about VestedImpact and what it does, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, Kristen. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. So I think you introduced Vested quite well, actually. I usually start off with saying it was a company that was started with a goal to redefine millionaire. But what it was started was the concept that currently you can invest, or at the time you could invest your money with risk and return, but you couldn't understand. Imagine if you could log on to your bank account and see what is the impact that your money has, not just how much it's made. So what it is it's a fintech, it's a data company. So we're a company that effectively assesses, quantifies the impact that companies have outwardly on the world's greatest issues. And we do that by leveraging over 100 million impact data points, which is data kind of from the UN, the World Bank, the OECD, ones like that. And the key thing that's different is at the time, and currently even, ESG metrics, what they look at is what is the risk of climate, of the environment, of social regulations on the value of the companies. But what we believe people actually care about is what's the impact that the companies have outwardly on these issues. So that's why we built Vested to do it. We've had to do it in a way that was kind of data-driven by independent data, that was as automated as possible, because get this right, we need to do it at scale. We're not even talking about, a lot of these metrics and that only look at the top 2,000 companies in the world, but there are millions of companies, and every single thing a company does inside of it has an impact outside of it, which is what we try to capture.
That's fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and your background? Because I find your journey fascinating, and you're obviously not from the UK, neither am I, but you're working in the UK. So tell me how you got started and kind of what led you to founding Vested.
Yeah, so I'm Australian by background, although my accent doesn't really give me away anymore because I've lived in the UK about 7 years now. But I'm an engineer by background. So I actually studied biomedical engineering at university. And was hell-bent on, I became an engineer because I believed actually that being an engineer places you in a unique position where you quite literally get to design and build the world around you. So that was why I set out to do it, which kind of got semi-derailed in my final year at university. I went to India to volunteer to teach just on a semester break, and I ended up founding a social enterprise in India that used economic empowerment of women to break the cycle of poverty. And why that was so important was actually, it was my first kind of realization that the power that businesses have, that the private sector has, to actually create change. Because whilst I was there, I was volunteering and it was a charity, and I just was like, the charity model isn't a sustainable model because it always relies on kind of giving or receiving, but a company generates its own revenue. Its growth is then dependent on how much impact it has, and it's self-sustaining. So that was my first foray kind of into, I guess, impact and business for good. And I ran that for about 5 years until we ended up handing it over to another organization to run And I sold my soul to the corporate world then as an engineer for a few years, which is what brought me to the UK, doing engineering innovation in aerospace. But I kind of never lost that itch, which was, I was head of engineering innovation at a big aerospace firm. And I remember thinking, I had a huge budget. We have some of the smartest people on the planet. We literally had 2 Nobel Prize winning scientists at Thales. And I just thought, but to me, we weren't solving problems that I believed mattered. And I thought, what if you took, that same approach to, applying those skills and that money into solving problems that actually matter to the world? So I quit with absolutely nothing lined up, with an eye that I was just going to go and solve some problems. And I ended up getting hired rather fortuitously by the UN. And so then my job for the UN for many years was building and designing for them a data platform to assess and monitor the impact that their $8 billion peacekeeping operations has. So the UN, just a very quick kind of thing, it operates much like a big company. You've kind of got the UN Security Council is a board of shareholders, so to speak. So they decide where the money goes. There's 13 peacekeeping missions in the world trying to keep peace, and every quarter they have to report back to the UN Security Council on what they did with the money. And like most companies in the world, they weren't reporting back their impact. They were simply reporting what they did. They would say, we did 5,000 patrols in Mali. Isn't that great? And the Security Council would go, well, what we actually care about is Mali safer? Are civilians at less risk? And, what we would say is impact metrics. So that was my big foray into how do we actually measure impact? How do we do it in a way that takes into account that different countries in the world and different solutions have different impacts depending on who they serve? And how do we do it in a way that's all backed by data, and data that's good enough to stand up to the likes of the UN Security Council, but similarly would stand up for a private company. So I did that and I founded Vested actually at the same time as I joined the UN, which was why it was quite fortuitous. I decided I wanted to solve the kind of ESG problem and then ended up there. So I did them in tandem until I was able to leave and do Vested full time, which has been the last couple of years.
I think that's amazing. I mean, and my next question is like, how on earth did you make that connection from, I mean, yes, you're an engineer, yes, you're focused on solving problems, but how did you make that jump, even at the same time, to peacekeeping data? And I understand that it's impact data, but it's really different to something working in fintech when, for me at least, and this may be my own naivete, like finance, if you don't have a finance background, is almost like closed off to those people who aren't part of the club. So how did you decide to do this work in fintech without having a background in finance?
I think firstly, it was probably my own bit of naivety and ignorance, in a sense that I was like, why can't I? But I think the thing was, it was almost my opportunity at the UN that changed my thinking a lot. Because similarly, the UN is an incredibly hard institution to get into and get a job. You need like crazy master's degrees, all those kind of things. Yet I, was largely in a way plucked out of nowhere. And it was because, and for a similar reason to why it's fintech, it was because these industries are very good at what they know, but they don't have the expertise outside of what they would call their business's normal. The UN has thousands of policy staff. They barely even had a data or an IT department. And that was the problem they need to solve. And that was my thinking for the finance sector. I just thought, this is an industry that understands risk, they understand return, they understand numbers. They don't understand impact, and they don't understand the reason it hasn't been done well is that very reason. You're taking finance people and trying to teach them to maybe care a little, instead of taking the people that know how to do it best and teach them the broader context in the sector. And that's always been my argument. I've often said that banks will say to me, why should we trust you or your system? And I say, why would you trust, Bloomberg or MSCI? It's like saying, would you trust the pilot to fly or the air hostess? And would you rather take a pilot and teach him to be an air hostess, or would you rather take an air hostess to teach them to be a pilot? Those learning curves are different. So I think there was a bit of my naivety when I just thought, why can't I? But I also think it's a huge advantage to anyone, like you do get people and investors that will say you don't have a background in the sector or you don't have a knowledge of it. And I've always, that question hasn't really sat well with me often, because from an innovation sense, best innovation often comes from those who don't know how it's been done before. And that was almost my blessing. Like, I kind of walked into the finance sector pretty naive on how they do much of what they do. And they'd be like, well, this just isn't how we build a portfolio. And I'm like, why not? And if you ask why enough, you see them have those moments of going, we can't actually tell you why, it's just how we've always done things. So I try, and I think a lot of sectors are waking up to that now, that actually that diversity of thought that comes from outside of your world can be the answer. But yeah, I kind of never really doubted that I couldn't, because I knew that I was good at what I did, and I just hoped that they would value that as useful to their sector.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love that answer, that kind of the best innovation comes from those who haven't done things before. And because you're right, you get so bogged down in, you know, working in a certain industry or a certain way or a certain job. And you know, it's like the theory of change. You don't understand why you need to do something differently. If you've always done it this way, it's hard to change. So I think that's really powerful. And I think that a lot of the startups that Breakthrough Labs works with who are pitching and get these kinds of questions, I know some of our founders maybe don't have backgrounds in their field either. It's a great answer. It's a great answer.
Yeah, I think too, one thing I will add though, there is the other answer is to always just say, I mean, there is diversity in that thought. And we often say, like, one of my big lessons at the UN was I went in and built this amazing data platform, and I didn't understand, like, because I hadn't been there before and been around the block a few times, that there were mistakes we made. And so it is about kind of going, you know, we have this innovation view, but we've got another person in the team or advisors or someone who can also say, because, you know, I do know that too, there is value in the, you know, the young innovative thinking or something, but there is value in the people that have been around the block a few times and have seen what doesn't work. And so, you know, that's where teams come in. And that's what I often say, it's, you need that different view, but it's nice to also say, we also have covered though the people that say, we've seen this a few times, we've seen what have or haven't, because it, you know, it does work. It does have value.
No, absolutely. That's, you know, teams and advisors and all of that. You're absolutely right. So tell us a bit about Vested's business model. I know that a lot of the startups we work with are kind of looking for their first customers. So I'm curious, you know, who are your customers? How did you find them? Like, how did you start finding your first customers?
So an interesting thing for us, just to, I guess, touch on the journey a little. So we started our life actually as an impact investing app. So I was like, we want more money to go into companies that are genuinely making a positive impact on the world. So yes, we have all the data to tell you who that is. And then we were like, and we'll also make the investment. So we actually started as a B2C model. And then we underwent a massive pivot. And that was because we realized that the USP, the thing that we did better than anyone, was actually the algorithm assessing the impact. It wasn't managing that deal flow or whatever. So we pivoted. So we're now B2B. But I will just say on that, do not be afraid to do a big pivot. It was the best thing we did, actually, because we wouldn't survive. We wouldn't have been alive today, actually, if we tried to compete and be, you know, one of those impact investing apps. And it is about knowing what you're good at. So we are a B2B, so we sell direct at the moment. We say to asset managers, so who anyone's not in the finance space, it basically means anybody who invests or who manages investments. They could be within a massive bank. They can be VCs and private equity firms. So our main customers actually at the moment are venture capitalist firms, private equity firms, who need to know and prove, are their investments actually good? And particularly funds that have a thesis that says we're an impact fund, they have to be able to prove it. So anybody who basically manages investments is who we sell to at the moment. But we're actually about to start kind of selling more direct to companies as well. And that's just because the regulation has shifted that a lot of the responsibility sits on companies, sorry. So for us, our model has been kind of selling B2B, and basically for us, it's a SaaS platform. It's a software as a service platform that people buy a license to, or if you're a big bank, you buy the data feed, right? It's an API, so which is great for us. The software model scales really well. It's got really high margins. It's all those wonderful things that does help when you're building a startup, but it obviously doesn't mean that, you know, other models don't work, but it has worked really well for us. Much different to what our B2C model would have worked like.
That's great advice. I mean, I know we have some startups that are thinking about making that move from B2C to B2B. So that's really, really good advice. Can you tell us about your experience seeking investment for Vested Impact? So, you know, warts and all, what were the positives and negatives, and kind of what's been your philosophy, and, you know, where did you end up, I guess?
Yeah, investment has been the hardest part of this whole journey. And I'll be really honest, I'm not going to sugarcoat it to any of the founders on the call. I often say, actually, you know, building an algorithm that measures something people didn't even think was possible was actually the easy part, because that's what I'm good at. But yeah, raising investment has been hard. We haven't actually done it well or successfully. Again, just to be honest, I don't want to be a downer, but just to say, you see all these amazing stories of people raising tens of millions. That's the exception most of the time. So for us, so the first thing I'll say is my first initial funding came from an angel investor. It was not someone I knew. It was someone that was introduced to me. It was a man, actually, which I'm always quite proud of, actually, that it was, and I think he should be, actually, that he took a bet on us when we were a pitch on a piece of paper. We didn't even have a product. And that was just £25,000. Again, to be really transparent, that was all we kind of had, and then it was bootstrapped. We did get some grant funding. I would highly, if you can get it, grant funding is really hard to get, but if you can get it, it's so useful because it doesn't take any equity. It's, you know, often it's for what you need. So again, I'm going to drop some names of things which, you know, so Village Capital is a really good US-based accelerator program. They give grant capital. So that was the appealing thing about them. They don't take equity. They'll do a kind of 12-week program with you, but they give grant funding. And the cool thing about it is it's allocated by the other founders on the course. You decide who gets the money. So anyway, so just a shout out to them, because actually they became our first customers. I didn't answer your question, Kristen, actually our first customers. I'll touch that in a moment. So then we took some grant capital, which really helped. And then I tried to raise for quite a bit, and we were pre-revenue, and a lot of people raised quite well pre-revenue. I found that once I stopped trying to raise and focused on trying to just make some money and get some customers, it drastically helped us. Once you have the validation and the social proof, not just that people like it, but that people will pay, massively helped. And then at the end of last year, we got a couple of other angels on board. We got an investment from a micro fund called Impact Shakers. Again, worth a look up. They're only very small, but they're underrepresented, founder focused, and super good. Like, I think two things on investment I found is don't think you have to raise money, actually, is the number one thing. So right now, we're not raising just because we've realized we'd rather make money than take money. Just because you see every other founder raising millions doesn't think it's the right thing for your company. So firstly, yeah, look at other ways of getting capital, or just focus on being a good sustainable business that generates revenue. And the second thing is really be careful and look closely at who you're looking for investment from, because people say it a lot, like that these people, they sit on your cap table, they're your advisors, they sit on your board. But I can't emphasize enough, I've been very fortunate. I have not had any bad investors, but I cannot emphasize enough how good a good investor is. Like, on so many levels, not just because, you know, they can make introductions and they might have more money when you need it. So one angel kind of could follow one for us when we got stuck last year with cash flow. But quite frankly, you know, I mentioned Impact Shakers. They're the kind of person that sits on your board, where when I said something about we were just busy and a bit stressed, I mean, the number one thing they care about, and they have a clause in their term sheet on founder well-being. That's incredible. And I think you don't get that from big institutional VCs and that. So just think about who you are and what's right for you. But yeah, I learned a lot about like reading closely about the terms, but just, are they good people? Are they going to treat you well when you need it as a founder? Because it's tough, it's stressful, and you need a board that's going to say it's okay to take a rest, not hustle harder when you can't possibly hustle any harder. So yeah, so that's been our journey. But I'll just quickly touch on actually on the generating revenue bit, because our first customer, and that's the hardest thing to get, is your first paying customer. So ours came from Village Capital, as I mentioned. They came from someone that knew us, that had actually basically kind of incubated us. And when we flipped B2B on their program, and then about a year later, when we were looking for customers and we realized we were pitching to VCs to use our product, I basically rang them and said, you know, you know exactly how we work. And credit to them, they were willing to pay for it as well. It wasn't like it was do me a favor. And I would highly encourage, as much as possible, don't give your product away for free. Make people pay something. Discount it, all that stuff, but make them pay something. And so yeah, they used it for a year in their Europe kind of fund, and then now they use it globally, and that's like 14,000 companies. They put through 250 companies in our system last year. They'll scale that up this year. And from that, it just snowballed, because people ask them, who do you use to prove your impact? And then yeah, and the other way that, and I think we might touch on this in a moment about networks. Then it just became the long journey of, you know, trying to get the big banks and some of the bigger customers, but getting just one makes such a difference, even for your own morale as well, to be honest. And you learn a lot from, you know, that one customer that you can iterate to help the others.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I imagine it must do wonders for your morale too. Like, you know, okay, I've done this once, it becomes easier for you to do it again as well. But yes, I definitely want to touch on how you got into these kind of finance networks, especially, you know, I'm American. I know how it is to be in this country and not always kind of fit in and know how to get into the right space. I didn't go to school here. I didn't go to university. Well, some university here, and you're the same. You know, you're Australian. You didn't go to Oxbridge. You didn't go to a UK private school. You're not in. I've talked to lots of people in finance who have that same experience, and they're kind of not part of the club, so to speak. So how did you then get your way into those networks that you needed to be in to kind of be at the table, basically?
Yeah, and I think it's relevant to fundraising too, because that was my initial frustration. Was I said, you know, I was kind of say I'm the reverse triple threat, as they would say in the acting world, in that I was a female, so you're underrepresented to start with. I was a migrant, so I'm not from here and and I was in a sector that, again, I don't fit in. So the biggest thing I did, and you have to shamelessly do, is A, try and build networks, but B, use them. People will say, oh, happy to make an introduction. Don't be afraid to ask them for it. I've really learned that you don't get if you don't ask. People don't offer if they don't genuinely want to help you anyway. But I've had to, as an introvert too, as an engineer who's an introvert and hates with big networking stuff, I've kind of had to learn that you have to do it, but fundamentally all of it's about building trust. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room or the one at all the events, but it is about, you know, telling people what you're doing, being really honest with them and authentic, and then it's just relationship building, both for sales and for VC. And 90% of the time, most of the people I talk to, they're not, you know, they won't buy my product or they won't do this, but they can hopefully introduce me to someone who will, or introduces me to someone who introduces me to someone. And I've just had to learn to be really patient with it, but to use it all I can. And that also means giving it. So I think I was talking to you earlier, Kristen, that there was an investor actually that I've been talking to, and I was doing her a few favors earlier today, introducing her to people that I knew in my network, because I think we all often know how tough it is in this space, particularly when you're underrepresented, particularly when you're a woman and you're underrepresented, but particularly if you've got other factors at play, if you're a woman of color, if you've, you know, come from a low socioeconomic background. So yeah, so honestly, I've tried really hard to build good connections, to really nurture them, and to give back, because it comes back to you most of the time as well.
I mean, I totally agree with that. I've always been a firm believer in this kind of, you know, this kind of karma, like everything comes back. You have to say yes, you have to agree, because you never know when you're going to be the one asking and needing that help. So I totally agree with you. So tell me about your team and building your team at Vested Impact. I think when we talked before, you mentioned that you started with your advisory board first. So I guess tell me advisory and what role they play, but then how, you know, as you started hiring, what did that look like?
Yeah, it might sound unorthodox, but I was a one-woman company, a team, literally. I mean, I had an idea on a piece of paper, and I got my advisory board on board. And I mean, like, I properly got them. They signed, you know, advisory agreements and everything. And it was the first thing I did. And I think for two reasons, because one, I was on my own as a founder in the team. I had no other team members. I built, and because I was a technical founder, to be fair, I could build the proof of concept and that largely myself. But it was also because I didn't come from networks of people with enough capital behind them that they could just quit their jobs and work for free with me. So I was not willing to kind of go out and convince people to take that risk with me yet. But I did know that I would need a huge amount of support and help. And so I put my advisory board in place for two reasons. And I'll be really, so the first one was because I just needed people to help me, to give me advice, to, you know, sometimes to give you a pat on the back and other times to kick you in the butt. But the second reason I did it, and I'll be honest about this, is it makes you look more credible as well. When you have a pitch deck and you have one person's name on it, i.e. your own, to also be able to have 5 really credible advisors underneath was a game changer as well. So, I mean, there's two reasons that I kind of did it to start with. But they ended up being one of the most valuable things I had, because I ended up being nearly on my own for over a year and a half. As I said, I built the whole first iteration of the product myself. Then I hired I brought in contractors initially, so I didn't have to commit to, and I didn't have to make them commit to being, you know, full-time staff. And now we just hit, actually, I think just last week, we hit 7. So we're not huge, but we are a software company, which means you don't have to have a load amount of people. But yeah, it's grown. And the board also has changed. And I think that's just another key thing, because people you need at different parts of your journey change. And as do also the people you meet, right? And the networks you have. So I built a really strong board at the start, but I actually had points like last year, one of my board members basically rang me and said, I'm going to step down off your board because I am not what you need now. And I thought that was really great for her, because board roles do look good for them as well. You've got to keep that in mind. It makes them look good sometimes to sit on your board. And yeah, and that was great. And I think I just touched on earlier, I said about, you know, if you don't ask, you don't get. I asked the CEO of UBS Bank Wealth here in the UK. I'd done quite a lot of stuff with them. I had a good relationship with the woman, and I just straight up asked her. I said, would you be interested in joining my board? I kind of thought she wouldn't be allowed, or she'd say no, and she said yes. And so I think that's the other thing I learned. Like, I was terrified, you know, I was quite terrified to ask, but if you don't ask, you know, you don't know. And it's the perfect, now, like, I've kind of rebuilt my board actually in the last few months to make it, you know, more what we need for the next couple of years. And then you look at it again. So yeah, so it's been that. To me, I do say to anyone, build a good board, build it of people and a good mix. I talk to one of my board members every week. She rings me every Wednesday. She's the CEO of a massive company, but she calls me every Wednesday on her way home. And sometimes it's 5 minutes. Sometimes it's an hour. Sometimes I cry, sometimes it's fine. And then I have other people that I talk to at the quarterly board meeting, maybe a few emails in between. You've just got to figure out what works for you and who works for you.
I love that. I love that you said, like, you know, because you just have to ask. I believe in that as well. But sometimes it is really hard to ask. But then you have to remind yourself the worst thing that can happen is that they'll say no. I
Yeah.
mean, life isn't over at that point.
And sometimes they'll say to you, I did ask someone recently, so I have a quite a senior person at the UN on my board, and I remember at the time I did offer my board shares or a very low but small amount of equity in the company. And a lot of them, they're not allowed to take remuneration if they sit in certain roles anyway. But I had one person say to me, like, it's a conflict of interest technically if I sit on your board, but I'm more than happy to be your personal mentor kind of thing. And I was like, great, I'll take that. Like, that's fine. So I think too, it's like you say, like, it's if people really want to help you, they'll often find a way. But I have found with most of the people I've asked, they've almost been waiting for me to ask. Like the CEO of UBS was almost like, finally, you decided to ask me. So I think sometimes it's actually nice for them to know that you recognize the value that they can bring and you appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I've found that people have been really flattered too. Like they're really pleased to be asked. And you don't think it's going to be something that makes them feel good. It's because it's a huge help for you. But actually they're flattered and pleased to be asked as well. Everybody feels good.
Most people wish, honestly, to everyone on this call, so many people wish and like they admire you and they wish they could be you. Like the amount of people that say, God, I wish I had the courage to build a startup, and I find it quite uncomfortable sometimes because I don't know about everyone on this call. I don't often feel courageous or brave, but they look at you and they just think, I want to have any part in this I can. And I think that's a lovely thing, but it does also mean that, you know, it's so many people actually want you to succeed and they want to help you succeed. So don't be afraid to use them and let them help.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I could ask you questions all afternoon, but I want to make sure that our attendees have a chance to ask you whatever questions they might want to ask as well. So if you have a question for Kim, go ahead and unmute yourself and turn your video on, and Kim is here to take your questions.
Should I start?
Go ahead, Vita.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk, and I think a lot of it resonated actually. I'm a tech founder as well, not from UK, not my domain expert. Should I go on? Anyway, so I was just wondering, as I'm going into pitching and the whole fundraising fun, like how do you convince the investor that you are the right person at the right time? And what kind of question did you get? Just so I can be prepared.
So I think one of the, and this is a good piece of feedback I got, was one of the most important slides, or basically one of the most important things you'll pitch is basically the why now, which is it's a combination of like, why is the money? Because you've got to think an investor's biggest thing is they want to basically buy low and sell high. So it's kind of like, and most of them will say you're too early for us. And I think that's actually the worst excuse, because if you're a good investor, you want to get in as early as possible. So it's pretty much convincing them that it's a big problem. And we absolutely have the right solution, but we're also kind of ahead of the game here. So if you don't come in now, you're going to miss the boat. And I think it's a big confidence thing for women, because I used to not pitch like that. I almost was grateful to be in the room. I would be like, I'd be really grateful if you would invest. And I almost shifted my language to being like, I'm giving you a chance to be on our rocket ship, not you doing me a favor. And I could almost see them like even in that attitude change shift. So I think that was just a slight bit of side note. And I think the questions I get or did get was actually so many questions about what you would do with the money. And that kind of surprised me because I often think, well, yeah, I'm just going to take the money and we'll just get bigger with it. But the amount of questions on like, not just what you're going to do with this money, but a plan for like, will you raise again? What are those next? Because the more thought out that is, and women tend to do this really good because we over plan, and particularly technical founders, because we have every stage planned out. They actually want to see that. They actually, you doesn't have to be in the pitch deck, but when they ask you a question and they know that you've thought that out, that was one of my most recent investors actually said that to me, because she said, I'd love to invest. I think you're great. So selling yourself is so important, because she said, I think you're a really investable founder, but I need to know more about where this is going to fit in your kind of go to market. I emailed back with a kind of, here's the plan and the steps for fundraising. We had a call, and then she was like, I'm in. But yeah, the number one thing is you. They're investing in you as a founder, so don't be afraid to sell yourself. Yeah, those two things are the biggest things I think I didn't do well in the initial times, and now I'm kind of much better at it.
That's great advice. And I think it's interesting because we have a salesperson who delivers a sales mindset workshop for our Breakthrough Labs Accelerator. And I've been talking to her as well. And she says the same thing, like, you're excited about this because this is your idea. You're committed to it. And you need to make sure that excitement and kind of the opportunity and this exclusivity of the opportunity comes through. You're not just going to take anybody on board as your investor, and it's an opportunity for them. So yeah. Does anybody else have any questions for Kim? I do have another one and nobody else has a question, but I'd love to give someone else a chance. Okay. I'm going to ask you about being a solo founder, because you hear a lot of times, I mean, there's people that don't invest in solo founders. There's, accelerators that don't want to work with solo founders, like Y Combinator talks about this. So, and then there is a question in the chat too that we'll ask next, but
actually your question links to my answer in the chat, so it's probably brilliant.
Great. Okay. So tell me.
I personally have never had any issue being a solo founder, because I think it's kind of the way I've often worked, but also because I did so much of the groundwork on my own. There came a point where absolutely so many investors, so many people will say, you need a co-founder. And I've been given that advice probably more times than I can count. I've absolutely considered it. I interviewed for co-founders. I tried to do all the right things. The reasons it didn't sit with me initially was also because I was a bit like, well, bringing someone in at this stage as a co-founder didn't really seem right. So my answer often, and if you are a solo founder, the reason they want a co-founder, you've got to understand where they're coming from. So the reason is it's risk. If I get sick, and someone said this to me recently, actually, one of the banks that we're trying to work with last year, they said, I mean, you're a sole founder, your team's so small. If, for example, 3 of you get COVID, I mean, that's half the team gone. And that's how they think about it. So it's de-risking it. But your alternate to that is to go, look, I don't have a co-founder, but I have a really good leadership team in place. Was kind of a hash, but I think the reason I say that's linked to Emma's question on turning down an investor. So this is quite a horror story, so don't get put off by it. But we did go through when we were raising money. We were trying to raise a couple of million last year. And I had a VC in Hong Kong. We went through all the due diligence with them. We had about 5 meetings. They were really happy with the business metrics. They were happy with the plan. They were happy with everything. They were willing to basically invest all the capital that we needed on one proviso, that I hired a co-founder. And without missing a beat, they also said that that co-founder had to be a man. Now, before everyone freaks out, the reason, their rationale, and again, they said this without thinking they thought it was completely rational, because A, they want to de-risk their investment, and B, they said to me, I'm in a male-dominated industry, so the business would have the best chance of success if it had a male as well. Now, they may not be entirely wrong. That may seem rational to them, but to Emma's point, I turned it down. I turned it down on the spot, actually, on the call, in a very polite way, but I just said that it's not something I'd be willing to do. Values wise, I do not regret it. Money wise, we've never had an offer quite like that again. And I know, if anyone knows Anne Bowden, the founder of Starling Bank, she outwardly talks about, actually, she took investment from a questionable investor at one point, and someone said, in hindsight, would you say no to that money? And she still says no, because she said money comes so infrequently for women. She's kind of like, don't turn it down when you get it. But that was the case for me of what I talked about being really careful about what investors you actually want. So yeah, to turn down an investor. And I think about, in hindsight, and again, I think if I hadn't if I'd had some better answers about like, look, I'm happy to have, you know, strengthen my senior leadership or, you know, do certain things, it might have worked. But just from their request for that, I just knew they probably weren't right for us then anyway. And I turned it down. But that's probably the only investor who's made an offer that I've turned down. I've had plenty of VCs that I've met with, and I've walked out the door going, well, I am not going to talk to them if they want to, because don't do business with jerks is like the #1 rule, right? So yeah, so that's the that's my unfortunate horror story. I am still a sole founder, but I've just, like I say, my narrative is now there's no need for a co-founder when you can have a good leadership team around it. So I just say that, and now I get the opposite. I had one of the VCs I just got actually said they like to invest in sole founders because that actually shows that if one person can get all that done, I mean, like, imagine how much they could get done if you know, you help them build a good team. So you'll find the investors, if you are a sole founder, that believes in it, but having a co-founder is seen as a good de-risking thing if you're happy to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. There really is such a fine line with investment and the offers that you might get of deciding like really what's going to be best, for you as a founder, you as a team, as a product, as you know, and having to work, you know, don't forget you have to work with these people for a long time.
So someone said that, you know, it's easier to get out of a divorce, to get out of a marriage than it is to get out of an investment with an investor. So, you know, that's quite sad when you think about it, but that's what you're getting yourself into, it's very hard to break up with these people once you take their money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Does anybody else have any questions, any more questions for Kim? Okay. I mean, I think this has just been, I love your story. I love the story of your journey. It was so, you know, I immediately kind of knew when we first met at UBS that you had such an interesting story, and I was dying to hear more about it. And then, so I'm so thrilled that you came here to tell it today and to answer questions from these female founders who joined us today. So I think, you know, unless anybody has a last minute question, I will probably let all of you go back to your afternoons. And thank you so much, Kim, to you for sharing your journey with us. And thank you to all of you who joined. We'll be doing more of these events in the future with entrepreneurs and for other kind of skills-based workshops. So check back on our website and LinkedIn and you will you'll see the latest. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, and I'll just say to everyone to feel free to be on LinkedIn and let me know if I can help. As I said before, I think the one thing I've loved about being a founder in this community is actually most companies, or at least most startups, I find at least, that we're not competitive with each other. We actually all just want one of us to succeed at least and get really good. So let me know if there's any way I can help. We didn't touch on too much on working with like big banks and that. Trust me, it's super hard and we're still trying to get there. But yeah, if I can make introductions to investors, or if there's people you see we're both connected, or someone I'm connected with you'd like an introduction to, happy to help wherever I can.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim. I really, really appreciate it. Until next time, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and good luck.